One of the things that I think we have to understand is that neoliberalism isn't just an attack on people's standards of living. Neoliberalism is actually penetrating the working class and affecting their ideas and how they think, and it's shaping class consciousness and also class formation. And I'm going to elaborate on that because it's a little bit abstract. Let me just say one other relatively abstract thing and develop that too. I think what we have to think about is not that workers aren't able to consume. Consumption is growing. It's incredibly unequal. But you look around you and you look at how much people are consuming. People are consuming quite a bit. It's not just a few rich people who buy all the Nike shoes and all the electronic goods and the SUVs. There's consumption going on, but it's the form through which people gain access to consumption that's changed. And it's also, there's a lot of talk in economics about people not saving. They're saving a lot. It's just the form through which they're saving has changed. I'm going to get back to both of these and explain what I mean with them. If you look at consumption, the way people are getting access to consumption now is increasingly it's been through working extra hours per family. It means working overtime. It means a spouse increasing the number of works. It means hours of work. It means students who, when I was a student, the great thing about being a student was you didn't have to work. You could hang around. You didn't have to go to class. But, my students all work at least 20 hours a week. That's kind of standard. I've got students who work 40 hours a week in my class in a full-time job. So people are maintaining their consumption through hours, and that kind of peaked at the end of the 80s. There's just so much hours that you can get. Debt, which has really increased through the 90s, and looking for tax cuts as a form of a wage increase. So what that means are people are consuming more, but the way they're getting access through it is very individualized. It means that you're doing it, you're not doing it through struggles on picket lines, and you're not doing it by being on the street, but you're doing it through this individual ways of trying to survive. The same thing goes with savings and trying to maintain some future security. It used to be that you put some money aside and that's how you'd get it. Now people go into debt so that they can buy a home or get a pension, both of which they then hope will rise in value, and that's where they'll really get their future savings. And what that means is that workers are debtors, savers, they lend money, and it integrates them in a very particular way because it means that they care very much about what's happening in financial markets. When somebody says we have to bail out the banks because that's necessary to save homes or pension funds, the argument is, I don't like it, but sure, we need it. In other words, there's a dependency that emerges. And I think slowly, I don't want to exaggerate this, but slowly you're seeing people who used to put their savings in a bank and leave it aside. Now they look at what the rate of return is. And they're actually sitting around doing these calculations and wanting advice on this. I had a call from a worker that we organizing some fairly militant actions in Bramalea, and they're doing all this radical stuff. And then out of the clear blue, I get a call, and he wants to know some advice about whether he should invest in gold or not. And I mean, this is a scary thought. So it means that on the one hand, the system is legitimated because it does help people consume. They're consuming a lot. Then finance, for all its chaos, is legitimated because people are involved in it. They they get access to a home. Then there's the question of competitiveness that Greg raised, which is absolutely destructive. Because, if you try to operate on the terrain of competitiveness and play the game, you're absolutely finished. It immediately means that your links aren't to other workers, but that they're your employers, as Greg emphasized. But other things are going on, too, through competitiveness. One is the incredible increase in the inequality. That's the logic of competitiveness. There's going to be winners and losers. There's going to be the restructuring of the workforce in terms of precarious work, et cetera. So then you're affecting class formation because of these divisions in the workplace. But there's another thing that's going on, and that is the restructuring that's going on. It doesn't just mean job losses. It means that you're restructuring communities. This is very important because radical consciousness and collective consciousness usually took a couple of generations to develop, of people working together in a particular community and having particular roots. And when that breaks up, if it broke up and there was a strong socialist consciousness, you'd think, gee, people are going to go to Alberta and revolutionize Alberta. That's not what's happening. You're breaking up communities, and it's going to be very difficult to get around that again and to rebuild those kinds of communities. And even when you talk to most workers, it isn't that they tell you that they think capitalism is wonderful. I meet very few workers who think that the system is wonderful. The problem is that they're fatalistic about it. You can't change it. And that becomes the problem. Not how do we criticize capitalism, but how do you start talking about what you can do about it. And part of that relates to the point that Greg made about the state. People used to, I think in some very misleading ways, think in terms of the state's going to be an answer to things, but they don't even have access to the state. When trade union leaders tell them that we need more state, workers think in terms of, you mean more police on the picket line when we're there? Wage controls, is this the kind of state that you mean? The experience with the state is things like, what's the most important body in the state today? It's the central bank forming policy, which nobody elects and Parliament can't talk about, or things happen in the executive, which nobody can talk about, and even labor departments, which were seen as somehow representing labor. Their role is to talk about competitiveness and bring labor into competitiveness. So one of the main points I really want to make is that neoliberalism has affected class formation. It's affected how the working class relates to each other. It's affected their confidence. It's affected their actual forms of struggle. There's been an atrophy of collective struggles. You don't use those things. They don't just sit there waiting for next time to use them. They actually start disappearing. There's a fragmentation on the part of workers. So the problem we have is that the defeat of the left, the greatest thing that we lost in the labor movement wasn't that we had some cutbacks in social programs or that people lost some wages. It's that expectations were lowered. That was the great defeat, that expectations were lowered. And I think if we think about this, one of the things that we have to recognize is that the defeat didn't just happen with neoliberalism. It was waiting to happen. There was something about the 50s and 60s that was crucial, and that was that we didn't have a transformative notion of changing capitalism and what kind of capacities we needed if we were going to take on capitalism. So it meant that, when capitalism was doing not bad, we could tag along. But when they said, wait a second, the rules are going to be changed, they actually found out what a paper tiger the labor movement was, because we didn't have that kind of a vision. We weren't radical, and we're paying the price for the lack of that radicalism. And when workers say, well, we can't talk about that kind of radicalism, we have immediate problems. That's the problem. That if we don't talk about those issues, we're just going to get hammered. One of the main thing that neoliberalism should have taught us, and Thatcher taught us this when she said, Tina, there is no solution, no alternative. Translating that, what she was basically saying, there's no alternative under capitalism. Either get radical or give up. And it was a challenge to us that we didn't take on and needed to take on. We either, as long as we remain within their logic of competitiveness, and this is all you can do under capitalism, we're going to be trapped. So we have to get radical. And I think the problem of the labor movement is that it hasn't recognized the fact that this is the starting point. I don't mean that you say, okay, we need a revolution tomorrow. But you start off by saying, what kind of capacities can we build, as Greg was emphasizing, so we can actually change the system. Then you start using that to shape our options. At one level, I think I might disagree with Greg in terms of his argument that we've got the alternatives. We've got lists of alternatives, but the question always is, can you do those things actually under capitalism? And that's a much more difficult question. I think where Greg is absolutely right is that the main question for us isn't do we have alternative policies, but do we have an alternative politics? That's what really has to be built. Now, I want to make this more concrete in terms of saying, okay, what if you start off with saying, okay, let's have a class analysis and let's think a little bit more radically. What might that actually mean in practice, other than we want a revolution or something, or socialism tomorrow? And I want to give half a dozen examples. When we look at the question of manufacturing, the first instinct of the labor movement is really to preserve the status quo. Let's save the jobs. And that's perfectly understandable. You're trying to defend people, and it's necessary. And especially manufacturing jobs are the best jobs, let's keep them. And I want to give an alternative perspective on this. One is, of course, you always defend workers when they're fighting to maintain their standards, when there's no other alternative, so you defend them, obviously. But the other thing that I want to raise is that if we really want to raise the question of jobs in the future, we have to link this to the environment somehow. And I don't mean linking it to the environment in terms of this or that plant when they close will be converted. I mean that if we're serious about the environment, we have to raise the fact that we're going to have to change everything. We're going to have to change everything, our values, what we make, and how we make it, and how we build infrastructure, and what public projects we need, everything. And for that, you do need manufacturing skills. One of the reasons for trying to save our manufacturing base is so we actually have the capacities to do that. And I think once you start raising it that way, you can't talk about it except talking about planning. And it's too big to imagine that you're going to do this through the market. So talking about that and getting that on the agenda is a way of actually challenging capitalism, challenging questions of investment. And the other thing that I want to raise about it is that in a way, when we say, well, manufacturing jobs are the best jobs, we're kind of giving up on other jobs. Why should other jobs be paid lousy? Who says that only manufacturing jobs should pay well, and if they disappear, other jobs shouldn't be paid well? The question is, why aren't other jobs paid a decent wage? The second thing is, when we talk about the public sector, we always tend to defend the public sector. More is better. That's fine, but it's also thin, because you have to talk about what the public sector is doing. And it isn't just about privatization. One of the things that's going on is the whole public sector is being commercialized, even when it's not privatized. It's being run increasingly on bureaucratic business criteria to serve an overall capitalist, the interests of an overall capitalist economy. And I think we have to think about, and this gets to Greg's point about how we think about the state, is that, and I think public sector workers have to lead this, to say, we want a particular kind of state that actually serves our communities. And that means we want it to be democratic. And that means that the kind of fights that public sector workers take on is about saying, we represent the public, they don't, we're going to challenge it, and that means democracy inside the state and a particular relationship to the rest of the working class. Again, a particular class relationship, instead of just thinking of the public sector in terms of particular interests. Finance. Everyone's now talking about the need to regulate finance. There's nothing that we don't have an interest in regulating finance. They're talking about regulating finance so they can save it, so that finance can continue to contribute to capitalist development. That's not our concern. Our concern is, how do you actually democratize finance and control it so we can do something about it, which means that you have to talk about what you're going to do with finance. And again, you have to talk about controlling investment. It's not just to make finance work better so that the banks and the investment houses don't go broke and corporations get the finance they need. It's actually to say, if we're going to regulate finance, it has to be in the social interest, and that means saying, for what purpose? Because we have ideas in terms of controlling investment. Empire. You can't have an honest, serious discussion about policy in Canada if you don't talk about our relationship to the United States. It's not serious if we just put together a list of 15 points that we want some progressive government to do, if part of this doesn't say, well, what's our relationship to the U.S. going to be? Which means we have to think about our oil policy. What is our oil policy? How do we relate to the U.S. empire? It means you have to talk about free trade in terms of the American empire. It means you have to talk about how is the U.S. going to respond, and how do we actually mobilize the kind of capacities we need to do that. It means that it's not the question of whether the U.S. is going to attack us when it responds. The people who are really going to attack us are Canadian business. That's going to be where the front lines of the issue is. And, in the auto industry, you can't talk about the auto pact. When you say we need an auto pact again, it sounds like you're saying free trade is good for everybody else, but not for auto workers. Who's going to support you and who's going to listen to that? If you want to take on something like an auto pact, and the principle was basically, if you want to make profits in this country, you've got to make commitments of investment and jobs. You have to take on free trade for everybody so you can actually mobilize and get people on side to win it. Organizing. I'm losing my papers here. Organizing. I don't think we're going to organize by working harder, by simply saying, boy, we've got to try a lot harder. If we're really going to talk about organizing we do have to think about it in class terms. We have to think about it in terms of what we're building as class power. And in order to do that, we have to do certain things. We have to put certain kinds of resources in, which means changing the priorities inside unions in terms of how they operate. And I don't just mean taking it away from servicing, because if you just take it away from servicing, then the question is, well, what kind of unions are you building and what kind of a base are you going to be building? I'm talking about addressing questions of staff salary. I'm talking about issues about perks in unions. And I'm talking also about people being willing to contribute some of their labor voluntarily. And to do that, you have to have a vision of what you're fighting for so that people will do that. You're only going to get the kind of energy and creativity if you've got some kind of vision about what organizing is about. Just to give one very quick example. If you really wanted to do something like organize the fast food sector in a place like Windsor, what should be done is we should say we're going to start servicing fast food workers. We're not going to ask them for dues. We're going to tell them that this is what we're going to start servicing them and addressing their needs, and there's going to be two outcomes of this. One is going to be at some point you might get enough of a concentration in some places that you can actually say, okay, let's form a formal union structure. And the other is that all the people in the fast food sector are going to move on to other jobs, and they're going to remember that the union actually represented them because they were young workers and not for any particular reason of its own, of self-interest. And in that way, you're starting to build a kind of a base that you can take advantage of in terms of organizing the working class. I'll give another example, NGOs. If you look at most NGOs, what you find, I'll use Toronto as an example, you find that they're led by very progressive people, that they're very limited because their funding depends on the state, that they're objectively picking up the pieces that neoliberalism has caused that have been farmed out of the state. So the question is, well, how can they be progressive? And I think the point is they can't actually lead because of their dependency and how they're structured, but they have all the contacts and communities that most of the left doesn't have contacts with. They actually know what's going on. And the question is, how does the left actually work with these groups in a way that it can be a front for them, in the way that it can create structures and to which they can send good activists that they come in touch with, and structures that we can fight through more generally. If people want to raise that, I can maybe develop that argument. I also want to make the point that there's, the greatest problem is that in the left, never mind the labor movement, it's like we're waiting for something. This waiting for Godot was written for the left. And, there's a sense that if things just get worse, somehow that'll give us the opportunities, as if we haven't had enough opportunities for 20 years. And there's something really wrong with this, first of all, just as, in terms of, well, why couldn't we do it before? But the other point about it is, well, what happens when things get worse? People give up more. They want, they're more insecure. They're trying to protect what they've already won. And the point in North America is that people have, over the decades, won substantial things. So what do we have in the United States is the UAW in the middle of the dollar falling at the fastest, to the largest degree ever, as far as I know, 50-60% versus Europe. America is becoming super competitive in the G7. It's about with Japan at the bottom. And what's happening? The workers just made the largest concessions in the history of the union. They cut wages in half. Auto workers will be hired and stay at wages below the average industrial wage in the United States. That is amazing. But the point is that nothing spontaneous happens because things get worse. And the other thing that happens when things get worse is that people have this wonderful idea. Let's just go back to how great it was last week. They romanticize the immediate past. We can't wait for it to be worse. There's nothing spontaneous going to happen about that. The most important point I think we have to keep reminding ourselves is we've developed on the left this culture of waiting. We're waiting for somebody to set up something that maybe we can all join, and then it'll really happen. If it isn't people in this room who decide, yes, I want to be part of actually making something happen, it's not going to happen. And that's the message. If we just keep waiting, we'll just keep waiting. Thank you.